Welcome aboard the Blind Date. Got a little project today, and hopefully it's not too difficult. Famous last words, right? So in the aft berth, below the aft berth, just aft of the engine, there's a piece of plywood. It's a 1/2 inch plywood, and mounted on that plywood is an electric fuel pump, also my sea strainer, and then one of the fuel filters. That plywood has a couple of pretty large holes in it. I'm worried about it falling apart with the vibration of the engine. So I want to replace that board. So I ended up ordering King Starboard, and that stuff's pretty expensive. And I got a sheet bigger than I really needed. But this stuff will last forever. So this is what I'm going to replace the plywood with. And since I'm replacing the plywood, I thought I would go ahead and replace the fuel pump. I have an electric fuel pump, and it's been on the boat since I bought it 22 years ago. The big benefit of the electric fuel pump is that when I change the fuel filters, instead of using the lever that's on the side of my 2GM20 Yanmar, I'm able to just turn the key, the ignition key, at the control panel, and it pumps the fuel through the fuel filter. So it's just much easier to have that fuel pump. So I do like it, but it's pretty rusty, so I want to go ahead and replace that. And then when I have the sea strainer off, I might go ahead and change the gaskets on the sea strainer as well. We'll see. I'll definitely need some new clamps for the fuel pump hose, and I might replace the hose when I get a better look at it. So we'll get in there and get started. I'm not going to cut the board, the starboard, here at the dock because it's plastic, and I'm going to get plastic shavings everywhere, including in the ocean. So I'll take that back and I'll cut it the same size as the plywood that's in the boat now. I'll cut that in my garage. Let me show you what the plywood looks like that's under the aft berth. This is the plywood I'm going to replace. On the far right is the fuel filter, and then in the middle is the fuel pump, and you can see a couple of holes above the screws where the fuel pump is fastened to the plywood. And then to the left is the sea strainer. I keep my seacock for the raw water intake closed when I'm not operating the boat. That's going to be important when I take this strainer apart, because I don't want water coming in the boat. So there'll be some water in this hose, and obviously there's water inside the strainer itself when I take it apart. But definitely you want that through hole, that seacock for the raw water intake, closed when you're doing any work on your strainer. So it looks like I have 3 wood screws holding this plywood onto the fiberglass behind it, and they put them in at an angle, so it does allow me to get to them a little easier. And hopefully these are the only ones I need to get out. Once the plywood is loose, I can move it away a little bit and give myself some more room to get these 2 bolts off that are holding the fuel filter on. One last one over here, at least as far as I can tell. Yep, that's it. So we've got it loose. And all these hoses connected to the strainer and to the fuel filter and the pump are kind of holding it up. But I can move it away a little bit to give myself some more space. I'll start with getting this one off, then the fuel pump. As always is the case, there'll be one that is really difficult to get out. The heads of these bolts are pretty much completely stripped out, so I need to replace the bolts. In addition to closing the through hole, the seacock for the raw water intake, I also closed the valve on the fuel tank. Now the 2 screws for the fuel pump. So I have the exact same fuel pump, the same model number and everything, and I'm just going to rewire it the way it was. The gaskets on these are definitely in pretty bad shape. Everything is still hooked up. The hoses are still on the strainer. The hoses are still on the fuel filter and on the fuel pump. So I think we've got everything off the board. I don't know how well you can see it, but this board is a mess. And it's a wonder that strainer didn't just fall off with the vibrations from the engine. Wow, look at this mess. So I will take this home, use it as a template, and cut a new one on the starboard. So I'm going to do some pilot holes, and I want to use the same places that they had the 3 screws that were holding the plywood to the fiberglass. I don't want to put any more holes in the boat than I have to. And they were drilled at an angle, so it was easier to screw and unscrew it. So I'm going to try to duplicate that same angle and just do a little pilot hole. So you might be saying to yourself, man, that's not straight. Well, it's not straight. The original wasn't straight. And the whole idea is I'm trying to get these 3 holes to line up like the original board did to the holes that are already in the fiberglass, so I don't have to drill any new holes in there. The less holes I put in my boat, the better, I think. So we'll see if I can get it to line up. So this is the fuel pump. And the way the fuel pump was mounted before was just like this. And that's with the inlet on top. So you have the fuel filter here, then the line goes to the tank. So fuel tank, line to the fuel filter, another line to the inlet of the fuel pump. Now the directions for this pump say never have the outlet below the inlet. So you can mount it, and the preferred way is to have it mounted like this at a diagonal when you're using, you know, a vertical board like this. But the reason why they say not to mount it with the outlet below the inlet is because of fuel vapors and vapor lock. But this is a diesel engine, diesel fuel, and vapor lock's not the same issue with diesel engines, at least not to that extent as far as I understand. I talked to the mechanic that's worked on this boat for a long time, decade plus. He's retired now, and discussed it with him, and he suggested just to remount it the way it was. It was that way for 20 plus years. It's been on the boat as long as I've had the boat, which is 22 years now, I guess, and there's never been a problem. So I'm going to mount it the same way that it was previously mounted. If I changed how the fuel pump was originally mounted, the problem with that would be my connection to the fuel filter, and I would probably have to use some different fittings. And then because the hose was running out below the sea strainer before, I would have to maybe bring everything down, bring the fuel filter down, and bring the pump down. So I'm just going to mount it the way it was. It's been on there all that time, but I did want to mention that the makers of this fuel pump say do not have the outlet below the inlet. and that's precisely the way it was mounted on this boat for a long time, and I'm just going to mount it that way again. I decided to get a new sea strainer rather than trying to replace parts on the old one, and it is pretty expensive. This should be the last strainer. The boat is a 1991, and I'm sure the sea strainer that was on there was the original, so this should be the last one that I need. I bought new fittings too. Just going to put some plumber's tape on the threads, and it'll be bolted right here. So what we still have to put on is the fuel filter, and I will probably remove these when I'm putting the board back on the boat, just because it's probably going to be in the way when I try to put these screws on. But we have the fuel filter here, so we have the fuel tank. The fuel tank has a hose that runs to this fuel filter. On the outlet side of the fuel filter, it will run to the inlet side of the fuel pump, and then there'll be a hose on the outlet side that will run from the fuel pump to the engine. And here it'll be connected to the raw water seacock intake, and then on the outlet side this barb fitting will go to the engine. And I think it's 3/4 hose to the seacock, and then to the engine I think is a 5/8 hose, if I'm correct. So now it's time to go to the boat and get this thing installed. We got the fitting off on the outlet. Now we just have to get the fitting off on the inlet. I should mention that I turned off the batteries, so there's no juice running to the control panel, the ignition switch, or to this fuel pump. Originally, the plywood that everything was attached to was just screwed into the fiberglass here. There wasn't any kind of backing. So I'm going to use this leftover starboard and place it here. And before, there were just 3 screws, here, here, and here, that were just like partially screwed in, and that was kind of the backing for the plywood. So the heads of the screws rested on the back of the plywood. And instead of doing that, hopefully using this piece of starboard, I'll get the right angle that I want with the new board. So I'm just going to screw this in and then screw the board in to this. I wanted to try to use all the holes that were previously drilled because I was trying to avoid putting new holes in the boat. And then lining those up and getting the board the way I wanted just turned out to be a nightmare. I filled all the holes with an epoxy. And you know, I was just being too particular really, then I make the job harder than it should be, because I didn't want to put new holes in the boat. It ended up being time consuming trying to get it to match up the old holes and get it to sit the way I wanted. So I should have just filled the holes in to start with, and I'll be making new holes. Here goes. I'll put some more holes in my boat. Attach this sea strainer. Just has to be low enough that you can put the cover back over this compartment. Having trouble getting this hose off. I'm actually thinking maybe I should just leave it on. It looks fine, but I did buy some new hose. I can get it to turn, but I can't get it off. So resort to cutting it. I got 2 new fittings for the fuel pump. The existing ones were really corroded, and these are made of brass. And I'm going to put some sealant on the threads, and I'm not going to use plumber's tape Instead, I'm going to use something called Permatex. So the instructions say to leave the first 3 threads free of the sealant, then put the sealant just on 3/4 of the thread. You don't have to go all the way around the thread, and you don't have to do all the thread either if it's not actually screwing into the pump. The only thing that concerns me a little bit is this one does not screw in very far into the pump. If I don't put it on the first 3 threads, there's going to be almost no sealant on the threads as it goes inside the fuel pump. So we'll see how it goes. We'll put the sealant on, and once we turn on the fuel, we'll find out whether or not we have any leaks. They say need this, and I did need it for quite a bit, but it still seems kind of runny. Alright, now I'm going to knead it a little bit more and see if it's not so runny on the other one. Yeah, definitely thicker. I actually shook it instead of just trying to knead it. And they say only go 3/4 of the way around. This is probably going to work better. If it leaks, I think it's going to leak on the other one. So I actually discovered after I put the hose on here that the way I've got it set up this time, if I'm going to use these holes down here, which I think I really need to because it needs to be out of the way of the water intake hose to the sea strainer, so I kind of do need to be low, but the hose was not long enough, so I'm going to have to cut another hose to put that on. But I'm going to screw it in temporarily just to see what length of hose that I need from the fuel filter to the fuel pump. And all these fuel lines only had 1 clamp on them instead of the 2 that are on all the water lines. And apparently that's standard. I'm talking to a diesel mechanic. So I'm just going to do it the way it was before, which is to put 1 clamp on each fuel line. Check for tightness on everything before I turn the fuel back on. This is the ground right here. It's kind of oxidized. I'm going to clean that up before I put that back on. Put a little grease on this. Hopefully it will keep it from rusting. Ground coming from the fuel pump, and the other ground goes to the engine. And this is the way it was previously wired, so I'm just going to wire it back the same way. Okay, so we've got our grounds done, and now it's just the hot wire, and this goes to the ignition. And I'm going to check and make sure that I do have the battery off. Have the battery off. Put a shrink sleeve on here. Now we have to put the hose on down here on the bottom. Alright, we got it all the way on. Tighten our clamp. I've bled all the air out of the system because I had the hoses off the fuel pump and the fuel filter. I needed to get the air out. So I bled that out, and while I was at it, I changed the primary and secondary fuel filter. So now we're ready to start it up. All right, it's running well. Success. Wow, that took way too long. The main problem was, and the mistake I made, was trying to use the existing holes that had been drilled into the boat and trying to create the new board where the holes lined up with the old holes was just a pain in the butt, and it didn't work very well anyway. So I finally just filled those holes with epoxy and made new holes, and that was the way to go. That's the way I should have done it from the very beginning and not been so OCD about putting holes in the boat. I would say about the King Starboard, it does act very much like wood in terms of being able to drill it and sand it, cut it, all that. My only reservation is that it makes a pretty big mess with plastic shavings and plastic dust. I know that plywood can be toxic too, particularly if it's been treated, but certainly when you're cutting plastic and you're leaving a mess like that, you kind of really think about that. And I certainly wouldn't have cut it down here at the boat because of that. Other than that, I thought that the Starboard worked really well, and this board is definitely an improvement over the old board. Would mention that the way I mounted the fuel pump is not the way the manufacturer recommends it. You should follow the recommendation of the manufacturer. I mounted it the way it had been mounted for 20 plus years on this boat, and I discussed it with a professional mechanic and got his input and decided to do that. But I would recommend that you either mount it the way the manufacturer suggests or contact their tech services to discuss it with them. Well, that's about it. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.